Laughter echoed across the auction lot as Andrea loaded her truck with 400 rotting watermelons. Her neighbors called her crazy, whispering she'd lose the farm by Christmas. But while their livestock withered in the brutal winter drought, Andrea's desperate gamble was about to orchestrate a staggering, impossible miracle. The earth of Oakhaven County was baked hard enough to shatter a steel plow. It hadn't rained a drop since early May, and by the time late October rolled around, the once lush pastures of Andrea Thatcher's farm had been reduced to a brittle, dust-choked wasteland. Andrea stood by the fence line, wiping a thick layer of grit from her forehead, her calloused hands trembling slightly as she surveyed her herd. 60 purebred boar goats, the legacy of her late father, bleated weakly in the oppressive afternoon heat. Their ribs were beginning to show beneath their patchy coats. Goats were notoriously resilient creatures, capable of surviving on scrub brush and weeds that cattle wouldn't dare touch. But even the thorny blackberry brambles at the edge of the property had withered into brittle ash. Andrea had spent the last of her savings on hay in August. Back then, a square bale of alfalfa cost $6. Now, driven by the merciless regional drought and rampant speculation, the price had skyrocketed to an astronomical $25 a bale. She couldn't afford it. The bank had already sent 2 fiercely worded letters regarding her missed mortgage payments, and the local feed store had officially cut off her line of credit. A cloud of white dust billowed down the long driveway, signaling the arrival of a vehicle. A pristine, heavy-duty truck pulled up to the gate, and out stepped Tyrone Myers. Tyrone was a third-generation corporate farmer whose strategy for expansion relied entirely on the misfortune of his neighbors. He owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, and his deep pockets meant he could afford to import hay from 3 states away. He didn't care about goats. He cared about the 50 acres of prime, albeit currently dry, river-bottom land that Andrea's farm sat upon. "Afternoon, Abby," Tyrone drawled, leaning heavily against the wooden fence. He didn't bother to take off his sunglasses. "Looks like your girls are having a rough time of it." "They'll be fine, Tyrone. We're managing," Andrea replied, her voice tight, trying to mask the desperate tremor in her chest. "Manage is a strong word for what I'm looking at," Tyrone said, gesturing loosely toward a young doe that was gnawing futilely on a piece of dry bark. "Winter is coming, and the farmer's almanac is predicting a hard freeze by Thanksgiving. You have no grass, no hay, and from what I hear at the bank, no cash. I'm not here to be the bad guy, Abby. I'm here to offer you a way out. I'll give you 40 cents on the dollar for the acreage. It's enough to pay off the bank and get you a nice apartment in the city. Leave the farming to people who can afford the weather." Andrea's jaw clenched. "This land has been in the Thatcher family for 90 years. I'm not selling it to you for pennies so you can bulldoze my barns and build another feedlot. Get off my property, Tyrone." Tyrone chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He tipped his hat in mock respect. "Have it your way. But when those goats start dropping, don't come crying to me for a bailout. I'll buy the land at the foreclosure auction in January anyway." As his truck disappeared back into the dust, Andrea felt a heavy stone settle in her stomach. He was arrogant, ruthless, and worst of all, he was right. If she didn't find a massive, cheap source of feed and hydration within the next week, the herd would perish. Desperation breeds unorthodox thinking. The following morning, Andrea drove her battered Chevy Silverado to the Oakhaven Agricultural Exchange. It was a massive open-air wholesale market where commercial farmers, grocers, and distributors bought and sold produce in bulk. Usually, it was a place for high-dollar transactions. But today, Andrea was looking for the rejects. The air at the far end of the market was thick with a cloying, sickly sweet aroma. A massive convoy of flatbed trucks from down south had been rejected by a major supermarket chain due to transit delays. The cargo? Watermelons. Hundreds upon hundreds of massive 30-pound watermelons that had sat in the sun far too long. They were overripe, heavily bruised, and actively beginning to ferment. The supermarket didn't want them. The food banks couldn't take them in their degrading condition. Gregory Webb, the head auctioneer, stood on a makeshift wooden podium, sweating profusely as he tried to offload the rotting mountain of fruit. "All right, folks, listen up," Gregory barked into his crackling microphone. "I've got 4 bins here, roughly 400 melons. They ain't pretty, and they sure ain't bound for a grocery shelf, but they'd make fine compost. Do I hear $100 for the lot? $100? The crowd of local farmers and buyers groaned. "I wouldn't take those if you paid me, Greg," a voice shouted from the back. "The yellow jackets are already swarming 'em. It's a biohazard." $50, Gregory pleaded, mopping his brow. "Somebody give me $50 so we don't have to pay the landfill fees." Andrea stared at the mountain of green and yellow rinds. Watermelons were heavily composed of water, packed with carbohydrates, sugars, and vitamins. The rinds were thick and fibrous. In her mind, she wasn't looking at rotting fruit. She was looking at thousands of pounds of hydration and calories. It was a massive risk. Goats were notoriously picky eaters, and abrupt changes to their diet, especially introducing massive amounts of fermenting sugar, could be fatal. But starvation was already a certainty. Andrea raised her numbered paddle high into the air. The entire auction lot went dead silent. Gregory Webb blinked, leaning forward to peer through the dusty sunlight. "Andrea Thatcher, you're bidding $50 on the rotting melons?" "That's right, Gregory. $50 for all 400, she said, her voice steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone snickered. Then a booming laugh erupted from the right side of the bleachers. It was Tyrone Myers, who had come to the auction to buy bulk mineral blocks for his cattle. "Good Lord, the drought finally broke her mind," Tyrone laughed, slapping his knee. "What are you going to do, Abby? Open a rotten fruit stand? Or are you trying to build a moat of flies to keep the bank away?" Laughter cascaded through the crowd. Neighbors she had known her entire life shook their heads in pity. They whispered that the Thatcher farm was officially dead, killed by desperation and a pickup truck full of garbage. Andrea ignored the stinging humiliation burning in her cheeks. She walked directly up to the clerk, handed over a crumpled $50 bill, and took the receipt. "Load them up," she told the forklift driver. Hauling 400 overripe watermelons back to Thatcher's Hollow was a grueling logistical nightmare. Andrea's old Chevy could only handle about 100 melons per trip due to the sheer, crushing weight. It took 4 exhausting, back-breaking journeys across the county. By the end of the day, her boots were covered in a sticky, sweet syrup, and her clothes smelled strongly of cheap fruit wine from the fermenting juices. She dumped the massive haul into an empty concrete silo foundation near the main barn. It looked like a graveyard of giant, bruised marbles. The buzzing of wasps and flies was immediate and deafening. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature plummeted, Andrea began her grand experiment. She selected a few of the most intact melons, carried them to the pasture fence, and smashed them open with a heavy splitting maul. The bright red flesh, though mushy, spilled out, releasing a powerful, sugary scent into the cool air. The goats, who had been resting lethargically in the dust, perked their long ears up. A large, dominant doe named Clementine cautiously approached the fence. She sniffed the shattered fruit, her nose wrinkling at the pungent smell. She took a tiny, tentative nibble of the red flesh, then a larger bite. Within seconds, Clementine was aggressively devouring the fruit, rind and all, the sticky juice running down her chin. Seeing their lead doe eat, the rest of the herd swarmed the fence line. Andrea spent the next 2 hours smashing melons, watching in pure relief as the starving animals gorged themselves on the water-dense fruit. For the first time in months, they went to sleep with full bellies. Andrea collapsed into bed that night, a triumphant smile on her face. She had outsmarted the drought. She had outsmarted Tyrone Myers. But nature is rarely so easily tamed. At 3 a.m, Andrea was jolted awake by a horrific, agonizing bleat coming from the pasture. She threw on her coat, grabbed a flashlight, and sprinted out into the biting cold. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness and landed on the Clementine. The doe was lying on her side in the dirt, her stomach painfully distended, thrashing her legs and groaning. Several other goats were pacing nervously, their bellies bloated and tight as drums. Andrea felt the blood drain from her face. Ruminal acidosis. She had been so focused on getting calories into the starving animals that she had ignored the basic biology of a ruminant's digestive system. Goats relied on a delicate balance of bacteria in their stomachs to break down roughage. By dumping massive amounts of rapidly fermenting, high-sugar watermelon into their empty stomachs, she had caused a catastrophic spike in lactic acid. The sugar was literally fermenting into toxic gas inside them, and if left untreated, the pressure would crush their lungs and kill them before dawn. Panic seized her, but the years of growing up on the farm kicked in. She sprinted to the feed room and grabbed the emergency medical kit. Step 1. Baking soda to neutralize the acid. Step 2. Mineral oil to coat the rumen and stop the frothy bloat. Step 3. Massage to release the gas. For the next 6 hours, in the freezing, pitch-black night, Andrea fought a desperate war against time. She forced a drench of baking soda and water down Clementine's throat, followed by a dose of mineral oil. Then she dropped to her knees in the dirt, heavily massaging the goat's left flank, trying to physically force the trapped ghouls to move. She moved from goat to goat, treating the 6 worst cases, her arms burning with exhaustion, her tears mixing with the dust on her face. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a pale, cold light across the valley, Clementine let out a loud, prolonged burp, followed by a heavy sigh. The doe scrambled weakly to her feet and shook herself. The others, though exhausted, were also standing. Andrea collapsed against the wooden fence, shivering and covered in sticky dirt. She had saved them, but the reality of the situation crashed down on her. She couldn't just feed them the watermelons. It was too rich, too sugary, and too dangerous. But she had nothing else. She had 400 watermelons and a herd that was still slowly starving. She needed a way to break down the sugars before the goats ate them, and she needed to dilute the fruit with fiber. But the only fiber she had access to was cheap, low-grade wheat straw, stuff that was normally used for bedding because it held absolutely zero nutritional value and was too tough for goats to digest. Then, looking at the massive pile of fermenting fruit, an insane, brilliant idea struck her. Silage. Farmers made silage by chopping up green forage, packing it tightly into airtight silos, and letting it ferment. The fermentation process essentially pre-digested the tough fibers, increasing the nutritional value and preserving the feed for winter. What if she applied the same principle, using the sugary, watery melons to break down the indigestible wheat straw? Andrea didn't have a multi-million-dollar concrete silo, but she did have 30 empty, heavy-duty 55-gallon plastic drums sitting in the equipment shed. She spent the next week working like a woman possessed. She bought the cheapest, lowest-grade straw she could find, stuff the feed store practically gave away. Then she set up a crude assembly line. Using an old wood chipper she had thoroughly cleaned, she began processing the watermelons. Into the roaring machine went the bruised, rotting melons. Out came a slurry of crushed rind, sweet juice, and pulverized seeds. Andrea layered the drums meticulously, a thick layer of dry, useless straw, followed by a heavy pour of the watermelon slurry, then a handful of agricultural limestone powder to regulate the acidity. She used a heavy wooden tamper to crush the layers down, squeezing every ounce of air out of the mixture to ensure an anaerobic environment. Once a drum was packed to the brim, she sealed it tight with a locking lid and rolled it into the barn. She repeated this grueling, messy process until all 400 watermelons and 3 tons of cheap straw were sealed away in the plastic barrels. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. 2 weeks later, the skies darkened, and the much-anticipated winter freeze hit Oakhaven County with devastating force. Temperatures plummeted into the teens. The ground froze solid. Across the valley, farmers scrambled to keep their water troughs from freezing, burning through their expensive hay stockpiles at an alarming rate. Tyrone Myers sat in his heated truck on the county road, peering through binoculars toward Andrea's farm. He fully expected to see buzzards circling the property. He expected to see frozen, starved carcasses. Instead, he lowered the binoculars, his brow furrowed in utter confusion. Through the biting winter wind, Andrea Thatcher was rolling a blue plastic barrel out into the snow-dusted pasture. She popped the lid. Instead of the putrid stench of rotting garbage, a rich, sweet, almost molasses-like aroma plumed into the cold air. The watermelon juice had perfectly fermented the tough straw, breaking down the rigid lignin walls and infusing the fiber with readily available calories, hydration, and vitamins. When Andrea poured the contents into the long wooden feed troughs, the goats descended upon it with frantic enthusiasm. They weren't just surviving. As the bitter winter raged on, Andrea's herd began to thrive. The heavy hydration in the silage kept their milk production up and prevented the deadly winter dehydration that plagued dry-fed herds. Their coats grew thick and glossy, shining with health against the bleak, frozen landscape. While Tyrone Myers was hemorrhaging cash, paying thousands of dollars a week to ship in premium alfalfa to keep his cattle from dropping weight in the freeze, Andrea was feeding her herd on $50 worth of rejected fruit and cheap bedding straw. She had turned the town's laughingstock into a masterclass in agricultural resilience. But as the deepest, most brutal stretch of January approached, bringing with it a historic blizzard that threatened to cut the valley off from the outside world entirely, Andrea's newly discovered miracle feed was about to be put to the ultimate test. Whiteout conditions swallowed Oakhaven County whole on the second Tuesday of January. It wasn't just a storm. It was a meteorological nightmare that stalled over the valley, dumping 36 inches of snow in less than 48 hours. The interstate highways were impassable. Supply chains snapped instantly. For farmers who relied on daily deliveries to keep their massive operations running, the snow was a death sentence. Over at Myers Cattle Company, panic had fully set in. Tyrone Myers paced the length of his lavish office, screaming into a satellite phone. The massive semi-trucks carrying his expensive alfalfa from 3 states away were stranded in a snowdrift 50 miles outside the county line. The local feed stores were empty. His automated water lines had frozen solid despite the commercial heaters, and his prize-winning Angus cattle were trapped in freezing feedlots, burning calories just to shiver. Without massive caloric intake, cows drop body temperature rapidly. "I don't care if you have to airlift it in," Tyrone barked into the receiver, slamming his fist onto his mahogany desk. "I am losing thousands of dollars an hour." "Tyrone, the National Guard has grounded all flights," the dispatcher's crackling voice replied. "Nobody is moving. You're on your own for at least 4 days. The line went dead. Tyrone stared out his frosted window at the hundreds of dark, shivering shapes huddled together in the raging wind. He was leveraged to the hilt. He had borrowed heavily against his land to buy more cattle and import feed during the drought, banking on absorbing smaller farms like Andrea's to balance his ledgers in the spring. Now, his entire empire was on the verge of freezing to death. 2 miles down the road, inside the sturdy wooden walls of Thatcher's Hollow, the atmosphere was entirely different. Andrea Thatcher secured the heavy iron latch on the main barn door, shutting out the howling blizzard. Inside, the air was surprisingly warm, thick with the smell of livestock and the sweet, molasses-like aroma of fermented watermelon. Her 60 boar goats were resting comfortably on deep beds of dry straw. They were chewing their cud, the ultimate sign of a relaxed and healthy ruminant. Andrea walked down the center aisle, popping the seal on barrel number 22. The silage had aged perfectly. The moisture from the melons had soaked deeply into the fibrous straw, breaking it down into a highly digestible, calorie-dense mash. Because the feed was packed with hydration, the goats didn't need to drink ice-cold water, which would have dangerously lowered their core temperatures. She scooped the steaming, rich mixture into the wooden troughs. Clementine, the lead doe, trotted over and began eating eagerly. Andrea smiled, stroking the goat's thick, coarse coat. She had enough barrels to last through February. Her gamble hadn't just saved her farm. It had created an impregnable fortress against the brutal elements. As she finished the evening chores, a violent, heavy pounding rattled the barn door. Andrea jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Nobody should be out in this weather. She grabbed a heavy iron pitchfork, her knuckles turning white, and cautiously unlatched the deadbolt. The wind ripped the door open, nearly knocking her off her feet. A massive, snow-covered figure stumbled inside, collapsing onto the hay-strewn floor. Andrea wrestled the heavy door shut, sealing out the roaring storm, and turned to look at the intruder. It was Tyrone Myers. His designer winter coat was torn and frozen solid. His lips were blue, his beard caked in thick ice, and he was violently trembling. He had driven his snowmobile across the buried fields, crashing it into a hidden ditch a half-mile away, and had walked the rest of the distance through waist-deep drifts. "Tyrone!" Andrea gasped, dropping the pitchfork. "What in God's name are you doing here? You could have frozen to death!" Tyrone couldn't speak at first. He just sat there in the dirt, gasping for air, shivering uncontrollably. Andrea quickly grabbed a heavy wool horse blanket and threw it over his shoulders, guiding him toward the small, wood-burning stove she used to heat the tack room. After 10 minutes of sitting next to the roaring fire, the color began to return to Tyrone's face. He looked around the barn, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw the healthy, fat goats. He saw the neat rows of blue plastic barrels. He smelled the rich, sweet feed. My cows, Tyrone rasped, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of his usual arrogance. Abby, my cows are dying. Andrea stood silent, her arms crossed over her chest. The memory of his cruel laughter at the auction echoed in her mind. He had wanted her to fail. He had waited like a vulture to pick the bones of her family's legacy. The trucks are stuck, Tyrone continued, staring at his trembling hands. The water lines are frozen. They have nothing to eat. They're dropping in the snow, Abby. Calves are freezing to the ground. He looked up at her, tears of pure desperation welling in his eyes. I know I've been a ruthless bastard to you. I know I don't deserve a damn ounce of pity. But the animals don't deserve to die for my arrogance. Please. He pointed a shaking finger at the blue barrels. I'll pay you whatever you want. $100 a barrel. 200. Just help me. Andrea stared at the man who had tormented her for over a year. The easiest, most vindictive thing to do would be to tell him to walk back out into the snow. If his cattle died, his corporate farm would go bankrupt, and the threat to Thatcher's Hollow would vanish forever. It was the perfect, poetic revenge. But as she looked at him, she didn't see a ruthless corporate tycoon. She saw a broken farmer pleading for the lives of his herd, and in the world of agriculture, there was an unwritten, sacred law. You never let an animal starve if you have the power to stop it. I'm not going to gouge you for cash, Tyrone, Andrea said quietly, her voice echoing in the warm tack room. I don't operate the way you do. Tyrone looked up, a glimmer of hope flashing in his eyes. Thank you, Abby. God, thank you. But I am not giving this to you for free, Andrea interrupted, her tone turning to steel. This feed is the only reason my farm is alive. I have 40 extra barrels, enough to get your most vulnerable stock through the next 3 days until the plows clear the highway. But my price isn't cash. Tyrone swallowed hard. What do you want? Andrea walked over to the wooden desk in the corner and pulled out a topographical map of Oakhaven County. She unrolled it onto the table and pointed to a thick red line separating their properties. You own the 20 acres of high meadow directly north of my fence line, Andrea said. It's got a natural spring that never freezes, and it's heavily wooded. I want it. Tyrone blinked. That land is worth $50,000. You want it for 40 barrels of garbage? It's not garbage, Andrea corrected sharply. It's highly nutritional silage, and right now it is the only thing standing between you and total bankruptcy. You told me to leave the farming to people who can afford the weather, Tyrone. Well, I adapted to the weather. You tried to buy your way out of it, and it failed. So here is the deal. You sign over the deed to the 20-acre meadow, and you sign a legally binding non-aggression contract stating you will never attempt to purchase Thatcher's Hollow or interfere with my credit at the bank again. Tyrone stared at the map. He was trapped, cornered by his own hubris, and defeated by a woman he had publicly mocked. The silence in the tack room dragged on, punctuated only by the crackle of the wood stove and the contented bleating of the goats in the main aisle. Slowly, heavily, Tyrone nodded. Okay, you win, Abby. You have a deal. The next 48 hours were a blur of grueling, punishing labor. As soon as the blizzard broke the following morning, leaving behind a pristine, frozen wasteland, they got to work. Andrea fired up her ancient, rusted tractor, wrapped the tires in heavy chains, and began plowing a path through the massive snowdrifts toward Myers Cattle Company. Together, they loaded the heavy blue barrels into the bucket of the tractor, shuttling them 2 miles down the frozen road to Tyrone's sprawling feedlots. When they finally cracked the first barrel open in the middle of the freezing cattle pen, The desperate, shivering Angus cows surrounded them. The sweet smell of the fermented watermelon silage cut through the bitter cold. The cattle, initially hesitant of the strange mixture, tasted the sugary, hydrating mash and immediately began devouring it. Andrea stood by the tractor, watching as life slowly returned to the freezing animals. Tyrone stood beside her, his shoulders slumped, watching his multi-million-dollar herd survive on a diet of cheap bedding straw and rotten fruit. "I really thought you were crazy that day at the auction," Tyrone murmured, watching a young calf happily chewing on a fermented watermelon rind. "I laughed at you in front of the whole county." "You weren't the only one," Andrea replied, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "But crazy is just what people call innovation. They don't understand yet." Spring eventually came to Oakhaven County, washing away the bitter memory of the drought and the brutal blizzard. The valley turned a vibrant, shocking green. At the local diner, the gossip had completely shifted. Nobody talked about the demise of Thatcher's Hollow anymore. Instead, they whispered about the stunning legal transfer of the 20-acre Myers High meadow to Andrea Thatcher. They talked about how her herd had doubled in size, grazing peacefully on lush new land. But the biggest shock of all came during the first agricultural county meeting of the year. When the topic of drought preparation and alternative feed sourcing was raised, Tyrone Myers, the arrogant corporate king of Oakhaven, stood up at the front of the hall. He didn't brag about his massive profits or his imported alfalfa. Instead, he yielded his time, turning to the back of the room where Andrea sat quietly. "I think," Tyrone said, his voice carrying a newfound humility, "we should all listen to Ms. Thatcher. She knows more about surviving hard times than anyone in this room." Andrea smiled, adjusting her worn baseball cap as she walked to the podium. She had bought 400 rotting watermelons to save her goats, and in the process, she had saved her farm, humbled her greatest rival, and proven that the heart of a true farmer doesn't beat in their wallet. It beats in their grit, their ingenuity, and their unwavering refusal to surrender. If you loved witnessing Andrea's brilliant strategy outsmart the corporate bully and save the farm, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who loves a satisfying underdog victory and brilliant life hacks. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another incredible tale of real-life survival and triumph. Leave a comment below. Would you have helped the rival farmer or let his empire fall?